The morning sun had barely broken the horizon when the world woke up to an agricultural earthquake. At the ports of Lagos, Mombasa, and Dar es Salaam, hundreds of American cargo ships sat motionless on the water, each one loaded with soybeans worth billions. Each one rejected, each one stranded. Their combined value, an astonishing $124 billion. But the real message behind those idle ships was worth far more. Africa had just told Washington, "We do not need you anymore." In the Midwest of the United States, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Farmers who were already struggling with bankruptcies, over 200 in-depth Chapter 12 filings last year alone, now faced the unimaginable. The silos were full, the prices were crashing, and the phones to Washington would not stop ringing. America, which had once boasted that it could feed the world, was suddenly staring at a market that had slammed the door shut. For decades, the story was one-sided. Africa imported, America exported. Subsidized U.S. Soy flooded African markets, undercut local farmers, and locked nations into dependency. But this time, the script flipped. African governments backed by farmer protests and months of quiet negotiations stood up with one voice. Our farmers come first. This is not just about soybeans. This is about sovereignty. This is about who gets to decide the future of food and, by extension, the future of power. And that raises a question that shakes more than Wall Street. Is this the beginning of the end for America's agricultural dominance? Or is it the birth of Africa's long-awaited independence? We are living through a turning point that will be studied for generations. And here on Voices of Africa, we bring you the unfiltered truth. Drop your country in the comments, because what you're about to see is not just a trade dispute. It is a declaration. It is Africa rising. The seeds of this story were planted long before African ports shut their gates. For years, warning signs flashed across America's farmland. According to economists at the University of Arkansas, farm bankruptcies under Chapter 12 had climbed to levels not seen in decades, over 250 filings from April to March, with this year's first quarter already surpassing the last year's total. Behind those numbers lay a painful truth. American farmers were producing more than the country could ever consume. Soybeans stood at the center of this crisis. U.S. farmers harvested more than 120 million metric tons annually. 40% of those crops had to leave American soil just to keep prices afloat. 1 in every 4 rows of soybeans planted across the United States was destined for foreign markets. For 2 decades, China absorbed much of that surplus, but when Beijing cut purchases, dropping imports from billions of dollars to virtually zero, the burden shifted elsewhere. Washington's eyes turned to Africa, a continent with rising populations and growing demand for protein. On paper, it looked like the perfect solution: send ship after ship of U.S. soybeans to African ports, sell them at subsidized rates, and keep American silos from overflowing. For Africa, though, this pattern was all too familiar. Cheap imports dumped into local markets, local farmers unable to compete, food security weakened, rural poverty deepened, and all the while, American agribusiness giants Cargill, ADM, Bunge counted profits in the billions. But Africa was changing. Over the past 5 years, governments across the continent had been quietly rewriting the rules. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia all invested heavily in local soybean production. Seed research centers were established. Irrigation projects turned savanna into farmland. Processing plants for soybean oil and animal feed were built not abroad, but on African soil. And through the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA leaders envisioned a market where African farmers would supply African tables. The tipping point came when farmer protests swept across capitals. They demanded protection from dumping, demanding that their crops be valued as much as imported goods. Leaders listened. Months of secret negotiations followed, during which ministers of trade accused U.S. exporters of predatory pricing, flooding markets with cheap soy, collapsing local production, then raising prices when dependency was locked in. The accusations struck a nerve, resonating with every farmer who had watched his livelihood threatened by foreign surplus. And so on a morning that will be remembered as historic, the announcement landed like a thunderclap. A coalition of over a dozen African nations declared a joint resolution effective immediately: no American soybeans or soybean byproducts would be allowed through their ports. The ban covered $124 billion in exports, a figure so large that Wall Street analysts first assumed it had to be a misprint. The images spoke louder than the headlines. Cargo ships bobbing in Lagos Tema Mombasa and Dar es Salaam, thousands of containers stacked with beans, their doors sealed, their futures uncertain. At the same time, African news channels broadcast footage of local farmers celebrating in their fields holding baskets of freshly harvested soy. Markets buzzed with buyers seeking African-grown soy oil and animal feed. On social media, hashtags trended with a simple but powerful phrase, "We feed ourselves." In Washington, the response was immediate panic. Phones rang nonstop as Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana farmers demanded answers. Politicians from Farm Belt states warned of national security risks. White House advisors scrambled to draft emergency memos before the markets opened. But no amount of spin could hide the reality Africa, once a captive market, had turned away. And this was no accident, no overnight decision. It was the culmination of years of preparation, a strategic, deliberate break from dependency. What shocked America most was not the rejection itself, but the unity. Africa had spoken with one voice, and the message was unmistakable. The era of being a dumping ground was over. The immediate fallout was devastating. Soybean futures collapsed by double digits within hours. Agricultural stock indexes plummeted. Billion-dollar corporations lobbied Congress for relief. And in rural America, farmers stared at silos overflowing with unsold grain, realizing that an entire continent had slipped through their fingers in a single night. This was the event that set everything else in motion. More than just an embargo, it was a declaration of intent, a signal that Africa's agricultural independence was no longer a dream, but a reality taking root. The true explosion came not in the fields, but in the boardrooms and capitals of the world. When the African Union's resolution hit international wires, global markets convulsed. Within minutes, soybean futures in Chicago collapsed by double digits. By the time Wall Street opened, billions had evaporated from agricultural indexes. Traders called it the soybean shockwave, the single largest disruption to the commodity market in a generation. In Iowa and Illinois, farmers who had just finished harvesting watched their phones in disbelief. The numbers were merciless. Prices sank to levels not seen in decades. Silos brimmed with unsold beans, and local lenders braced for defaults. Hotlines at the Department of Agriculture were overwhelmed with calls. Some farmers asked how they would feed their families through winter. Others raged, demanding to know how Washington had let them become so vulnerable to a continent they had long been told was dependent on America's grain. Panic spread quickly to Washington, D.C. In the West Wing, advisors scrambled to prepare talking points for a shaken president. Leaks to the press described 3:00 a.m. meetings, emergency memos, and a cabinet split between confrontation and conciliation. Senators from Farm Belt states thundered that this was no mere trade dispute. It was a national security crisis. The farm lobby, one of the most powerful political forces in the country, threatened to withdraw support from incumbents unless action was taken. Across the ocean, however, the mood could not have been more different. In Ouagadougou, Accra, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa, farmers poured into the streets in spontaneous celebration. Tractors rolled through towns draped in flags. Radio hosts called the ban "our second independence." On social media, images went viral of children holding signs that read, "Africa feeds Africa." For the first time, rural farmers long marginalized were being celebrated as national heroes. Governments echoed that pride. Ghana's president declared in a televised address, "This is not an attack on America. This is a declaration of African sovereignty. We will no longer allow foreign crops to dictate whether our farmers prosper or perish." The speech was translated into dozens of languages and shared across diaspora communities worldwide. Young Africans who often fled to cities in search of work began to see farming not as a symbol of poverty, but as a path to dignity and nation building. American agribusiness giants reacted with fury. Executives from Cargill, ADM, and Bunge lobbied Congress relentlessly, warning that billions in profits and thousands of jobs were at stake. Yet even they were forced to admit what had been ignored for too long: Africa had prepared meticulously for this moment. Deals with Brazil, India, and China ensured that African farmers had access to seeds technology and infrastructure. Processing plants once idle now ran 24 hours a day. Cooperatives pooled resources, giving smallholders bargaining power against multinational giants. Meanwhile, the media split along predictable lines. American networks described the decision as a catastrophe using words like betrayal and sabotage. African outlets called it a victory and a rebirth. The contrast was stark, one continent mourning lost profits, the other celebrating newfound freedom. Even within the United States, cracks appeared. Some analysts on financial channels admitted that Washington had long relied on agriculture as a weapon, using food aid and cheap exports as leverage to extract political concessions. With Africa's blockade, that weapon was gone. What remained was anger, disbelief, and a dawning realization that America's dominance in food was no longer unchallenged. The geopolitical consequences widened by the day. Brazil saw an opening and rushed to sign joint ventures with African nations, not to dominate, but to collaborate. India offered training programs for agritech startups. China pledged to buy African soy directly, ensuring guaranteed markets. The message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer isolated. It had partners, it had options, and it had leverage. For Washington, the sting was personal. This was not just about crops, it was about dignity. For decades, American diplomats had arrived in African capitals with food aid packages in one hand and political demands in the other. Now, those same diplomats were being told politely but firmly, no reversal, no compromise. The ban was final. The climax of this confrontation was captured in one viral image: a group of African farmers standing hand in hand before a cargo ship that had once carried U.S. soybeans, now empty, now irrelevant. Behind them hung a banner with 3 words that summed up the entire movement: "We feed ourselves." That was the turning point. What began as an economic dispute had transformed into something far larger: a psychological victory, a cultural revolution, and a geopolitical earthquake. The world now understood that this was no temporary embargo. It was the opening shot in a new era of agricultural independence. The aftershocks of Africa's soybean blockade did not stop at the water's edge. They rippled deep into societies and governments on both sides of the Atlantic, reshaping politics, livelihoods, and even the psychology of entire nations. In the United States, the fallout struck hardest in the Farm Belt. Town halls in Iowa and Indiana filled with angry, anxious farmers demanding answers. Some spoke of losing land their families had tilled for generations. Others confessed they could no longer pay the loans that kept their machinery running. For rural communities already strained by depopulation and poverty, the soybean collapse was not just an economic blow, it was an existential one. Banks began tightening, credit foreclosures loomed, and small towns braced for waves of outmigration. Politically, the shock turned toxic. Senators from agricultural states accused Washington of arrogance, of taking Africa for granted, of assuming the continent would never dare cut ties. The farm lobby, long considered untouchable in U.S. politics, began to fracture. Some demanded subsidies and emergency bailouts. Others called for renegotiated trade deals that treated Africa with respect instead of contempt. What united them all was fury. For the first time in decades, America's farmers were turning their anger not outward, but inward toward their own leaders. The White House faced a dilemma it could not easily solve. To admit failure meant acknowledging that U.S. agricultural dominance had been broken. To retaliate with sanctions or WTO lawsuits risked further alienating African nations and pushing them closer to new partners like Brazil, China, and India. The administration tried to project confidence, but leaks from inside told a different story: late-night meetings, sleepless aides, and a president visibly rattled by the realization that one of America's most reliable export markets had vanished overnight. Meanwhile, in Africa, the political consequences were profound, but in the opposite direction. Leaders who had risked their reputations on this gamble now stood taller than ever. In Ghana, the president's fiery speech declaring African sovereignty went viral, making him a continental icon. In Burkina Faso, farmers marched through Ouagadougou, not in protest, but in celebration, carrying banners that read, "Our soil, our future." Across Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, the ban was framed not as economic policy, but as national liberation. The impact on civil society was equally dramatic. For decades, young Africans had abandoned rural life, fleeing to overcrowded cities in search of work. Farming was seen as a trap, a sign of failure. But in the wake of the blockade, that perception shifted. Governments offered subsidies for cooperatives, grants for local processors, and tax breaks for agritech startups. Universities launched new programs in agricultural science. Suddenly, farming was no longer a symbol of despair. It was a symbol of pride and opportunity. This transformation touched daily life. Markets that once sold imported soy oil now displayed bottles pressed from African beans. Restaurants advertised meals cooked with locally grown ingredients. Radio programs celebrated farmers as national heroes, and children in schools learned about food sovereignty alongside history and mathematics. The cultural shift was unmistakable. Agriculture was no longer about survival. It was about dignity, independence, and power. Internationally, Africa's bold move altered political alliances. Nations once seen as dependent recipients of aid now negotiated from a position of strength. African diplomats, emboldened by unity, pushed for reforms at the United Nations and in trade forums. The message was consistent: Africa would no longer be bullied by unfair trade practices. Instead, it would chart its own course. For Washington, the humiliation was severe. Allies in Europe whispered about American weakness. Rivals in Asia hailed Africa's defiance as proof that the world order was shifting. Within months, analysts were calling the soybean blockade a watershed moment, a point after which U.S. influence in Africa could never fully recover. At the civil level, the human face of this transformation was even more powerful. In small villages across Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Ethiopia, farmers held community feasts, sharing bread and soy stew made from their own harvests. The pride was palpable. For the first time, one farmer told reporters, "I know my children will eat food grown by our hands, not dumped from ships across the ocean." The political elites in Washington may have seen only lost profits, but for African farmers and their families, this was something far greater. It was a rebirth, a reclaiming of dignity long denied. And in that rebirth lay the seeds of a political and cultural revolution that no embargo, no sanction, no foreign threat could easily undo. From Washington's perspective, the soybean blockade was more than a trade dispute, it was a humiliation. For decades, American leaders had treated food exports as leverage, a tool to pressure and persuade foreign governments. Now, with one resolution, Africa had stripped that weapon away. Policy experts warned Congress that the farm crisis could quickly spiral into a political crisis, especially in swing states where soybean farmers formed a powerful voting bloc. Some analysts even described the blockade as the most serious challenge to U.S. agricultural dominance since World War II. The reaction inside the Beltway was split. Hawks in the Senate demanded retaliation, sanctions, aid cuts, even WTO lawsuits. Others urged restraint, admitting that America's arrogance had driven Africa toward new partners. The debate revealed a truth long ignored in Washington: the era of unquestioned U.S. dominance in African markets was ending. Beyond America, the world watched with fascination and calculation. In Beijing, officials framed Africa's stand as proof that a multipolar order was taking shape. India praised the decision, offering training and technology to help African farmers scale their production. Brazil saw opportunity racing to negotiate cooperative ventures with African processors. European leaders, though cautious, recognized that the balance of power in global agriculture had shifted overnight. Most striking, however, was the psychological shift. For decades, Africa had been portrayed as dependent, vulnerable, a consumer rather than a producer. Now it was seen as an actor with agency, reshaping trade maps on its own terms. Media outlets across Asia and Latin America carried headlines hailing Africa's defiance as a declaration of dignity. Even in the United States, a handful of commentators admitted that the blockade forced a long overdue reckoning, that partnership, not paternalism, was the only path forward. This global response made one truth undeniable: Africa was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. It was a player, one capable of rewriting the rules. The image remains unforgettable: African farmers standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a cargo ship, once destined for their ports, holding hands beneath a banner that read, "We feed ourselves." That picture captured more than a policy shift. It marked the dawn of a new century, a century where Africa defines its own destiny. For the United States, the lesson is harsh but necessary. Food can no longer be wielded as a weapon. Markets can no longer be assumed permanent. And power can no longer be measured only in dollars and exports. Washington must now decide whether it will cling to a collapsing order or accept the reality of a rising Africa, an Africa unafraid to say no. For Africa, the road ahead will not be easy. Unity will be tested. External pressure will intensify. There will be attempts to bribe, destabilize, or intimidate leaders into reversing course. But momentum is on the side of the farmers, the cooperatives, and the millions of young people who now see agriculture as a future of pride rather than poverty. What began with soybeans could soon spread to wheat, rice, even fuel. And if Africa stays the course, the ripple effects will reshape every corner of the global economy. The deeper question, however, lies not in Washington or Brussels, but in the hearts of ordinary people. Can Americans come to terms with a world where Africa is no longer subordinate but sovereign? And can Africans themselves maintain the unity required to defend this fragile new independence? These are not just economic questions, they are moral ones. Because in the end, this story is not about soybeans, ships, or silos. It is about dignity. It is about a farmer in Burkina Faso planting seeds in his own soil and knowing that his children will eat food grown by his own hands. It is about a mother in Ghana who no longer fears that foreign imports will collapse the market where she sells her produce. It is about a continent finally saying enough. So I leave you with this. Do you believe this soybean blockade is the first step toward Africa's true economic independence? Or do you fear that Washington's retaliation could unravel this fragile progress? And closer to home, can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies, or should another leader carry the torch forward? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you feel you are among the first to witness Africa's agricultural revolution, share this video widely and subscribe if you believe that truth, real unfiltered truth, is more important than headlines. Because history is unfolding before our eyes. And one thing is clear, Africa is rising and no one can stop what has already begun.